In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, the French were absolutely wrecked by the Germans/Prussians in that war. After all, Napoleon III was no Napoleon I, or just Napoleon, because, that's the guy you think of when someone says Napoleon. Napoleon III did not have the military skills of his uncle, and the Germans utilized railroads very effectively in that war and outmaneuvered the French at quite a few points. But the war was a huge disaster for France. The government collapsed, a republic was put in place after the Second French Empire, and the prestige of the nation dropped. They lost Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans, and following the war, the French allied themselves with the Russians and later on the British. This is what would become known as the Triple Entente. So now Germany found itself in a bit of a pickle, because if they got involved in a war with France, they would also be fighting Russia, at the very least. Britain was kind of about joining a European war, but at the very least the Germans would be fighting France and Russia. So a two-front war. So Germany would have to divert a lot of its strength and manpower and resources to two separate fronts, and Germany would eventually be worn down and lose. So Germany wanted to avoid this, and they made plans in case of a war with the Russo-French alliance. So Helmut von Moltke, the guy who was in charge of the German army in the 1870s, who played a huge role in the German victory in the Franco-Prussian War, he wanted to focus against the Russians and thought that the war would be won in the east. Basically, Germany goes on the defensive in France and advances into Russian Poland and Lithuania and sets up a defensive line there. Moltke thought that the Germans couldn't advance to Moscow. After all, Napoleon had done that and lost. So Moltke thought the best plan of action would be to take Poland and Lithuania. That way there would be a shorter front and wear the Russians down over time. The French border would be guarded by the Germans. But in 1891, a guy named Alfred von Schlieffen became German Army Chief of Staff. And he had a different idea on how to win the war. He saw that Russia was a huge country that had poor infrastructure and railroads, as well as regular roads. So he thought that it would take Russia multiple weeks to mobilize, much longer than it would take the Germans and the French. So during that time period, the Germans would only have to contend with the French. And during that, the Germans would have a numerical superiority over the French. So he thought, why don't we just defeat the French first and then move over to the Russian border and defeat the Russians? So Schlieffen saw how the French had built up a series of forts along the Franco-German border since the Franco-Prussian War. Very large defensive forts, fort line. It was essentially a pre-World War I version of the Maginot Line, but not in Alsace-Lorraine. So Schlieffen thought, simply, let's go around this defensive line. Now, you can't go through Switzerland because Switzerland's mountainous, so he decided to go through the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, which is a flat area mostly, and encircle Paris from the north, take Paris, and win the war. Belgium also had a series of forts to deter the Germans of an invasion, so this is why the Germans would also invade the Netherlands, to bypass Belgian forts by going around the Netherlands and through the north of Belgium. This plan is originally developed around 1905 by Schlieffen, and he continues to work on it until his death in early 1913, making little tweaks, but no major changes. But after Schlieffen, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, who was the nephew of the original Moltke, becomes the German Army Chief of Staff, and he also does some tweaks to the plan, removing the invasion of the Netherlands, as Moltke thought that it would be a good supply depot for the Germans to get supplies from, in case Germany was blockaded. And the plan would go a little something like this. The Germans would launch limited attacks against the French across the Alsace-Lorraine border to tie the French armies there down, and they would move through Luxembourg and Belgium and take Paris from the north and then encircle the French armies fighting in the Vosges region next to Alsace-Lorraine, and thus the war would be won. And the French would surrender, and Germany would win in the west and transfer its troops to fight the Russians. This is the plan that's implemented in 1914 at the start of World War I, and it fails due to a couple of reasons. First, the British were pissed off that Germany was invading neutral countries, especially since Britain and Prussia had signed a treaty back in 1839, the Treaty of London, that guaranteed Belgian independence and neutrality. And the Germans didn't anticipate that violating Belgian neutrality would cause the British to join the war. And also, when the Belgians are fighting the Germans don't think they'll put up much of a fight, but at battles like at the fortress city of Liège, the Belgians do a really good job of slowing the Germans down, and this allows the French to, begin to redeploy troops up north and slows down the invasion. And also a big thing was that Russia did not take as long to mobilize as the Germans thought it would. And by the time that the Schlieffen plan's really getting to its climax and it's been slowed down by the Belgians, the Russians have started to invade East Prussia, so Germany has to send some of its troops from the Western Front to go fight the Russians in the east. They get close to Paris, but at the Battle of the Marne, the French and the British beat back the Germans after a gap opens up in the German lines, and the Germans retreat to northern France and dig in. This is the beginning of trench warfare on the Western Front. And yeah, East Prussia was only defended by like 250,000 Germans, and over 500,000 Russians were invading. And with the amount of troops that Germany had to transfer over there, they could not press the advantage. And of course, Germany would ultimately go on to lose World War I, even though the Russians were defeated. And the Germans never really would continue to make strategic mistakes throughout the interwar period and in operation and in World War II. Barbarossa, Fall Blau, Citadel. I guess the Germans never really did learn their lesson. But thank you for watching, and a huge thank you for getting for 100 subscribers, 3 digits now. It's pretty amazing, and I did not think I would ever get this far. We're at like over 14,000 views, and it's pretty insane. This video wasn't the most in-depth or detailed, but I wanted to experiment with something new and doing narrations and voices and whatever in that animation I did earlier in the video. So I'll learn to improve all this and do better audio editing and whatever, but this was an experiment. So thank you. Any feedback is welcome. And thank you guys again for 100 subscribers. It's pretty